We have Dr. Jose Vieira Leitao, and I'm sure I just massacred that.
Close enough.
From the Center for the History of Society and Culture at the University of Coimbra, The City Between Heaven and Hell, Urban Folk Magic and Contextual Catholicism.
Okay, good. So this presentation basically is about what appears to be a consistent and coherent system of folk magic that seemed to be happening in Iberian and South American urban centers throughout all of the modern period. Now, since the 80s, probably earlier, there have been a number of studies of Portuguese and Spanish and South American scholars published in all, even in Portuguese, Spanish, and English, that seem to often notice the recurrence of certain magical procedures happening throughout all of these geographical spaces, which maintain themselves surprisingly coherent throughout centuries. Now, strangely, to me, nobody ever bothered connecting the dots and maybe thinking that something might be actually happening here, that this is an indication of some form of continuity or some form of cultural consistency happening in urban centers. Well, when I started doing my own work in the Inquisition, I also started to notice the dozens of instances of the same magical procedures happening again and again and again, year after year. And so I decided to pay attention to this. So I did a survey, and I focused on the Lisbon Inquisition. For those who don't know, Portugal had 3 branches of the Inquisition. Lisbon was one of them. And I did a survey of the Lisbon Inquisition, and I found 105 trials that all seem to describe the same system of magic. Breaking these down a bit, out of these 105, 87 of them were solely located in the city of Lisbon. Now, for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on these 87 trials because it's a very good sample size, and coming all from the same geographical area, it's pretty good to get an idea of what's going on here. To now try to figure out exactly what this style of folk magic is, we need to start breaking this down. So if we go into demographics, 81 of these trials are against women, 6 against men. So this is a style of magic completely dominated by women. And not solely just women, it's socially vulnerable women. Prostitutes, widows, the wives of sailors, the mistresses of powerful noblemen. If we then look at the procedures themselves, this style of magic is specialized in 3 particular areas. Manipulation, meaning sexual and domination magic. Divination, particularly for the determination of thoughts, wills, and locations of individuals. And bodily protection. If we further boil this down, then basically the preoccupation is mundane financial preoccupations of health and well-being. This shouldn't be taken as a surprise, as financial and bodily protection is actually the main preoccupation of folk magic, be it in a city or in a rural context. Folk magic is very pragmatical, very focused on problems that people have immediately. Learned magic, meaning magic that usually has a source, has a literary source, and is typical of more educated classes, then talks about the elevation of the spirit or the elevation of the intellect. Folk magic has no preoccupations with that whatsoever. It's about survivability. So, in particular, this style of magic, these women were attempting to use this style of magic to acquire power over a man, and in that way acquire physical protection and financial protection. Now, to really understand, then, obviously we're talking about the system of folk magic, and this is extraordinarily fluid. But given the recurrence of all of these procedures, we can, as scholars, try to construct what the inherent cosmology or inner logic of all these processes means. So, in essence, this style of magic cannot be considered to be separate or antagonistic to regular Christian Catholic religiosity. It is, in fact, entirely dependent on the conception of the cosmos as described by the Catholic Church. It is particularly dependent on the existence of heaven, hell, and purgatory as spiritual spaces populated by intermediary spirits that are petitioned by this style of magic in order to enact some kind of change. In this way, one of the methods that might be used to approach this style of magic from an academic perspective might not be so much as a style of magic in itself, but rather as a culturally and socially contextualized Catholicism. On all accounts, the people who participated in this style of magic were devout Catholics. They were simply using alternative methods to interact with the same universe as the priest does during Mass. So this is kind of a free-range Catholicism. In particular, this style of magic is also entirely dependent on the spiritual reality and effectiveness of the Catholic Mass and the Catholic sacraments. To now look at how, in detail, what exactly the procedures associated with this style of magic are. These then focus on petitions to needy souls or restless dead, residing in either purgatory or hell, devils in hell, saints in heaven, and other ambiguous agencies which we'll also deal with. To now look at the souls in purgatory, these tend to be petitioned via devotions and masses. Masses, just regular Catholic masses that you can just buy. And devotions, it's just you pray a certain number of prayers, Our Fathers and Hail Marys, and you offer these to a soul in exchange for a service. Souls usually provide information on divination and fortune in love, gambling, and business. Other spirits of the dead are also petitioned, which are more ambiguous, and they tend to be petitioned as lesser spirits under the command of greater demons. Souls in purgatory tend to be, in the Catholic perspective, very passive spirits. So there seems to be a petitioning of restless dead to make more aggressive petitions, such as bending of wills or torture of a particular victim. In terms of demons or evil spirits, these tend to be petitioned by a technique called a boiling and offerings of food. A boiling, basically you just gather a recipient with some vinegar or oil in it. You then put irritating substances in, such as peppers or chilies, and you boil it and you summon an evil spirit. And then you usually offer food as bread and cheese, which you throw out the window, and if you see any animals eating that food, those animals actually represent the spirits you just summoned and that they accept this offer. These types of spirits are petitioned for more heavy-duty work, such as bending of wills, torture, and rarely divination. In terms of specificity, the spirits in this system tend to be called in groups of threes, let's call them trinities. What might be called the greater spirits, or spirits that are summoned more coherently, are Barrabás, Caifás, and Satanás, which just translate as Barabbas, Caifás, and Satan. These three names rhyme, so there's a preoccupation of alliteration here, so there's some poetics going on. These are the three most common, but other names that also come up in these groups of threes can be Lucifer or Beelzebub. Besides these, you have what might be called lesser spirits, which are spirits summoned in second place to the greater spirits, which might have names such as the Lame Devil or Maria de Padilha. Maria de Padilha is an important case, because this is actually a historical character. Maria de Padilha was the lover of Peter I of Castile from the 14th century, who during her own lifetime was famed as a sorceress. And so after she died, her name starts appearing in folk magic procedures as an infernal spirit. Interestingly, if you focus on the Portuguese case, mentions to Maria de Padilha show up firstly in trials of Castilian immigrants. Only a few years later do the Portuguese residents adopt that spirit and start summoning it. And then later it starts showing up in Brazil. So you can trace a chronologic evolution throughout space with it. Now, this spirit is usually petitioned with a very characteristic phrase, Maria de Padilha e toda a sua quadrilha, which might be translated Maria de Padilha and all her posse, gang, or family. Now, before going into saints, just to cover these ambiguous agencies, these can be of various natures. There are devotions to several stars, something called the devotion of the paloma or the dove, or the devotion of the door. The devotion of the door I'm going to give here as an example because it's good to illustrate how first of all, this system of magic works and how fluid these spirit categories can become. So the petition of the door starts by you summoning an actual physical door. You need to have a door in front of you. I measure and conjure thee door with thy portal from which a particular individual entered, left, and shall enter again. You then summon 3 spirits of the dead. 3 hanged men with 3 dragged men with 3 killed by cold iron for love. You petition these spirits to go pick black juniper branches and sharpen them into spikes and place them in the hand of Barabbas, one of the greater spirits, who then goes and tortures this person until they enter through the door that you summoned in the first place. Now,
so it's a protection one.
No, it's a torture and bending of wills. It's
for a specific against a particular person.
To get it's usually this is used by, say that you are the lover of a nobleman, you just had sex with them, you want them to come back, you see the door they went through, and then you do this at the door to make sure that he comes back. So, saints, this is the more interesting category. Obviously, in a Christian perspective, these are taken to be quite positive spirits. But in this system of magic, they're actually summoned for exactly the same purpose as any other spirit, domination and divination. Domination, the selection of saints made here, these tend to be saints whose iconography or hagiography have something to do with dominating something. The paradigmatic example is Saint Martha, whose hagiographical narrative has her taming a dragon in southern France. So as she tames a dragon, she can equally tame the will of a man, so she is summoned for that purpose. Saint Leonard is another common one. This is the patron saint of prisoners, and his iconography involves chains. And probably the most common one in this system of magic is Saint Erasmus. Extremely frequent, mentioned many times. He's usually summoned with what's called the devotion of Saint Erasmus, which is an extremely lengthy text that you need to do in front of an image of the tortures of Erasmus, and then you petition that those tortures get transferred to somebody else. When it comes to divination, or neuromancy, or the divination through dreams, is usually done by the summoning of Saint Helen or Saint Anne. Hydromancy is also used, which is the gazing into waters, done by the summoning of Saint Cyprian. Saint Cyprian, as time goes by, particularly when you enter the 19th century, is also associated with cartomancy. Now, it's the Cyprian hydromancy and cartomancy are intrinsically related, because if you look at the hydromancy rituals that you have in the 16th and 17th century, they actually have the same verbal incantation that you're supposed to say before the divination, that's also present in 19th century cartomancy. So there is a verbal continuity between both of these. Now, St. Cyprian is also associated with a particular text called the Prayer of St. Cyprian. This isn't a particularly Iberian or South American text. This is present in most of Europe, most of the West. There are even Arabic versions in Ethiopia, at least. And this is a talismanic prayer. A prayer that you might carry with you in order to physically and spiritually protect you. It might also be used as an exorcism. In terms of the prayer of St. Cyprian can also be used as something called a carta de tocar, which can be translated as a touching card. These are physical talismans for physical protection, and they usually are talismanic prayers. And cartas tocar have the particularity that they always have a pictorial component. The production of a carta tocar implies that these need to be placed under a Catholic altar, and a number of masses needs to be said over them in order for them to acquire some kind of virtue. There were actually a number of priests who would have this as a side business. They would produce cartas tocar, these types of talismans, and then sell them. The pictorial elements tend to be references to the Passion of Christ, or the schematic representation of weapons such as guns or blades. The designs tend to be very folkish in nature. You would call these, I guess, naive art. But some of them, and this also illustrates the fluidity of this system, can become quite complex and start to have alchemical or astrological symbols. If we then expand even our visions a bit further, these can become quite complex and beautiful. These two are two examples from Brazil, for example. One of them seems to have some kind of influence from Solomonic magic, and the other one... Yeah, but it's actually Christian in content. And the other one.
I can show you very similar, but in Arabic.
Yes. The other one actually has African elements. Now, having described roughly, I'll admit, this style of folk magic, what are the historical implications of this? Is this simply just a historical curiosity of something that people were doing like 200 years ago? Or can this actually tell us something valuable for the understanding of magic and religion contemporarily? Well, we can look at, for example, the books of Saint Cyprian. Books of Saint Cyprian are a literary tradition in Iberia and South America. These are essentially magic books, grimoires, and there are references to manuscript books of Saint Cyprian as early as the 17th century, but the book that today you can buy in Portugal as a Book of Saint Cyprian is a product of the 19th century. As such, these can be understood more accurately as belonging to the intellectual tradition of occultism, which is a 19th century movement. But still, it is a book of Saint Cyprian, and like I said, Saint Cyprian is a saint which is used in this particular style of early modern folk magic. In fact, the prayer of Saint Cyprian is frequently featured in the book of Saint Cyprian, as are Cyprian divination methods. Besides this book also contains elements that are clearly derived from folk magic. And this is actually one of them. This is a consecration of a magical fava bean. And we can see that it actually summons the exact same spirits as we have on early modern folk magic. Summons Lucifer, Satan, and Barabbas. And not only that, it then goes on to say, my black magic I give to Maria de Padilha, all her family, all the devils from hell, lame walkers, near blinds, cripples, and everything that is infernal. So we have that the same verbal incantation, the same entities that were being called upon in early modern 16th century and 17th century folk magic appear in a 19th century publication, suggesting some kind of continuity between both elements. Now, if we even cross the Atlantic and we look at the Afro-Brazilian cults of Umbanda and Quimbanda, these are cults that focus heavily on spirit work. Devotees are supposed to actually be possessed by spirits. One of the spirits that they work extensively with is Saint Cyprian once again. Now, I'll admit this isn't a smoking gun. Saint Cyprian isn't a particularly Iberian saint. It's a Western Christian saint. But another spirit that they work with, particularly in Quimbanda, is also Maria de Padilha. Maria de Padilha currently features in Quimbanda as a pomba gira, which is a particular category of spirit usually associated with a certain marginality and criminality. Some pomba giras are considered to be the spirits of prostitutes. And she is summoned in Quimbanda pretty much for the same purposes that she was in Iberian folk magic. So what are the conclusions of this? One of the problems when you're dealing with academic research is that it's very hard to study anything that hasn't been given a name or defined. I think that the issue that all these Iberian and South American scholars who have managed to identify several procedures belonging to the system of magic, the reason why they never identify this as an actual system of magic, something somewhat coherent that's happening throughout all of these centuries, is simply because nobody ever bothered giving it a name. Now, this is a local academic problem, perhaps, that scholars still don't have the notion that you can't just treat magic as an opaque category. You need to constantly contextualize magic in terms of geography, time, culture, financial circumstances, economic circumstances, and political circumstances. All of these factors, every single variation of these factors generates an opportunity for a new form of magic to be created. I, for one, then give it a name. I call it early modern urban Iberian folk magic. It's not elegant, but it is what it is. Having identified this, I believe this is a fundamental pillar, a cornerstone, not only for the understanding of magic, religion, and esotericism in the Iberian and South American early modern period, it is equally a fundamental piece for the interpretation and accurate understanding of these same things in the contemporary period. Thank you.